he himself seeing his own father and sisters and brothers as the owner, the rich man, not the nigger, must have been seeing them all the time as cattle, creatures heavy and without grace, brutally evacuated into a world without hope or purpose for them, who would in turn spawn with brutish and vicious prolixity, populate, double, treble, and compound, fill space and earth with a race whose future would be a succession of cut down and patched and made over garments bought on exorbitant credit because they were white people, from stores where niggers were given the garments free, with for sole heritage that expression on a balloon face bursting with laughter, which had looked out at some unremembered and nameless progenitor who had knocked at a door when he was a little boy and been told by a nigger to go around to the back. "But I can shoot him." And the other, "No, that wouldn't do no good." And the first, "What shall we do then?" And the other, "I don't know." And the first, "But I can shoot him. I could slip right up there through them bushes and lay there until he comes out to lay in the hammock and shoot him." And the other, "No, that wouldn't do no good." And the first, "Then what shall we do?" And the other, "I don't know." Now he was hungry. It was before dinner when he went to the big house, and now there was no sun at all where he crouched, though he could still see sun in the tops of the trees around him. But his stomach had already told him it was late, and that it would be later still when he reached home. And then he said he began to think. Home. Home. And that he thought at first that he was trying to laugh, and that he kept on telling himself it was laughing even after he knew better. Home, as he came out of the woods and approached it, still hidden yet, and looked at it. The rough, partly rotten log walls, the sagging roof, whose missing shingles they did not replace, but just set pans and buckets under the leaks, the lean-to roof which they used for kitchen, and which was all right because in good weather it didn't even matter that it had no chimney, since they did not attempt to use it at all when it rained, and his sister pumping rhythmic up and down above a wash-tub in the yard, her back toward him, shapeless in a calico dress and a pair of the old man's shoes, unlaced and flapping about her bare ankles, and broad in the beam as a cow, the very labor she was doing, brutish and stupidly out of all proportion to its reward, the very primary essence of labor, toil, reduced to its crude absolute, which only a beast could and would endure. And now, he said, the thought striking him for the first time as to what he would tell his father when the old man asked him if he had delivered the message, whether he would lie or not, since if he did lie, he would be found out maybe at once, since probably the man had already sent a nigger down to see why whatever it was his father had failed to do and had sent the excuse for was not done. Granted that that was what his errand to the house had been, which, granted his old man, it probably was. But it didn't happen at once, because his father was not at home yet. So it was only the sister, as if she had been waiting not for the wood, but just for him to return, for the opportunity to use her vocal cords, nagging at him to fetch the wood, and he not refusing, not objecting, just not hearing her, paying any attention to her, because he was still thinking. Then the old man came, and the sister told on him, and the old man made him fetch the wood, and still nothing said about the errand while they ate supper, nor when he went and lay down on the pallet where he slept and where he went to bed by just lying down, only not to sleep now, just lying there with his hands under his head, and still nothing said about it, and he still not knowing if he was going to lie or not, because he said how the terrible part of it had not occurred to him yet. He just lay there while the two of them argued inside of him, speaking in orderly turn, both calm, even leaning backward to be calm and reasonable and unrancorous. "But I can kill him." "No, that wouldn't do no good." "Then what shall we do about it?" "I don't know." and he just listening, not especially interested, he said, hearing the two of them without listening, because what he was thinking about now he hadn't asked for. It was just there, natural in a boy, a child, and he not paying any attention to it either, because it was what a boy would have thought. And he knew that to do what he had to do in order to live with himself, he would have to think it out straight, as a man would, thinking, "The nigger never give me a chance to tell him what it was, and so he, not the nigger now either, won't know it, and whatever it is won't get done, and he won't know it ain't done until too late. So he will get paid back that much for what he set that nigger to do. And if it was only to tell him that the stable, the house was on fire, and the nigger wouldn't even let me tell him, warn him." And then he said that all of a sudden it was not thinking, it was something shouting it almost loud enough for his sisters on the other pallet and his father in the bed with the two youngest, and filling the room with alcohol snoring, to hear too. "He never even give me a chance to say it, not even to tell it, say it." It too fast, too mixed up to be thinking, it all kind of shouting at him at once, boiling out and over him like the nigger laughing. "He never give me a chance to say it, and Pap never asked me if I told him or not, and so he can't even know that Pap sent him any message, and so whether he got it or not can't even matter, not even to Pap. I went up to that door for that nigger to tell me never to come to that front door again, and I not only wasn't doing any good to him by telling it or any harm to him by not telling it. There ain't any good or harm either in the living world that I can do to him." It was like that, he said, like an explosion, a bright glare that vanished and left nothing, no ashes nor refuse, just a limitless flat plain with the severe shape of his intact innocence rising from it like a monument, that innocence instructing him as calm as the others had ever spoken, using his own rifle analogy to do it with. And when it said them in place of he or him, it meant more than all the human, puny mortals under the sun that might lie in hammocks all afternoon with their shoes off. If you were fixing to combat them that had the fine rifles, the first thing you would do would be to get yourself the nearest thing to a fine rifle you could borrow or steal or make, wouldn't it? And he said, yes. But this ain't a question of rifles. So to combat them, you have got to have what they have that made them do what he did. You have got to have land and niggers and a fine house to combat them with, you see? And he said yes again. He left that night. He waked before day and departed just like he went to bed, by rising from the pallet and tiptoeing out of the house. He never saw any of his family again. He went to the West Indies. Quentin had not moved, not even to raise his head from its attitude of brooding bemusement upon the open letter which lay on the open textbook, his hands lying on the table before him on either side of the book and the letter, one half of which slanted upward from the transverse crease without support, as if it had learned half the secret of levitation. That was how he said it. He and Grandfather were sitting on a log now because the dogs had faulted. That is, they had treed, a tree from which he, the architect, could not have escaped, yet which he had undoubtedly mounted, because they found the sapling pole with his suspenders still knotted about one end of it that he had used to climb the tree, though at first they could not understand why the suspenders, and it was 3 hours before they comprehended that the architect had used architecture, physics, to elude them, as a man always falls back upon what he knows best in a crisis, the murderer upon murder, the thief thieving, the liar lying. He, the architect, knew about the wild Negroes, even if he couldn't have known that Sutphin would get dogs. He had chosen that tree and hauled that pole up after him and calculated stress and distance and trajectory, and had crossed a gap to the next nearest tree that a flying squirrel could not have crossed, and traveled from there on, from tree to tree, for almost half a mile before he put foot on the ground again. It was 3 hours before one of the wild niggers, the dogs wouldn't leave the tree, they said he was in it, found where he had come down. So he and Grandfather sat on the log and talked, and one of the wild niggers went back to camp for grub and the rest of the whiskey, and they blew the other men in with horns, and they ate, and he told Grandfather some more of it while they waited. He went to the West Indies. That's how he said it, not how he managed to find where the West Indies were, nor where ships departed from to go there, nor how he got to where the ships were, and he got in one, nor how he liked the sea, nor about the hardships of a sailor's life, and it must have been hardship indeed for him, a boy of 14 or 15 who had never seen the ocean before, going to sea in 1823. He just said, "So I went to the West Indies," sitting there on the log with Grandfather while the dogs still bayed the trees, where they believed the architect was because he would have to be there, saying it just like that day 30 years later when he sat in Grandfather's office, in his fine clothes now, even though they were a little soiled and worn with 3 years of war, with money to rattle in his pocket, and his beard at its prime, too, beard, body, and intellect at that peak which all the different parts that make a man reach, where he can say, "I did all that I set out to do, and I could stop here if I wanted to, and no man to chide me with sloth, not even myself." And maybe this, the instant which fate always picks out to blackjack you, only the peak feels so sound and stable that the beginning of the falling is hidden for a little while, with his head flung up a little in that attitude that nobody ever knew exactly who he had aped it from, or if he did not perhaps learn it, too, from the same book out of which he taught himself the words, the bombastic phrases with which Grandfather said he even asked you for a match for his cigar, or offered you the cigar, and nothing of vanity, nothing comic in it either, Grandfather said, because of that innocence which he had never lost, because after it finally told him what to do that night, he forgot about it, and didn't know that he still had it, and told Grandfather, told him, mind, not excusing, asking for no pity, not explaining, asking for no exculpation, just told Grandfather how he had put his first wife aside like 11th and 12th century kings did. I found that she was not and could never be, through no fault of her own, adjunctive or incremental to the design which I had in mind, so I provided for her and put her aside, telling Grandfather in that same tone while they sat on the log, waiting for the niggers to come back with the other guests and the whiskey. So I went to the West Indies. I had had some schooling during a part of one winter, enough to have learned something about them, to realize that they would be most suitable to the expediency of my requirements. He didn't remember how he came to go to school, that is, why his father decided all of a sudden to send him, what nebulous vision or shape might have evolved out of the fog of alcohol and nigger-beating and scheming to avoid work, which his old man called his mind, the image not of ambition or glory, not to see his son better himself for his own sake, probably not even some blind instant of revolt against that same house whose roof had leaked on probably 100 families like his, which had come and lived beneath it and vanished and left no trace, nothing, not even rags and broken crockery, but was probably mere vindictive envy toward one or two men, planters, whom he had to see every now and then. Anyway, he went to school for about 3 months one winter, an adolescent boy of 13 or 14 in a room full of children 3 or 4 years younger than he, and 3 or 4 years further advanced, and he not only probably bigger than the teacher, the kind of teacher that would be teaching a one-room country school in a nest of tidewater plantation, but a good deal more of a man, who probably brought into the school with him, along with his sober, watchful mountain reserve, a good deal of latent insubordination that he would not be aware of any more than he would be aware at first that the teacher was afraid of him. It would not be intractability, and maybe you couldn't call it pride either, but maybe just the self-reliance of mountains and solitude, since some of his blood, at least, his mother was a mountain woman, a Scottish woman who, so he told Grandfather, never did quite learn to speak English, had been bred in mountains, but which, whatever it was that which forbade him to condescend to memorize dry sums and such, but which did permit him to listen when the teacher read aloud. Sent to school, where, he told grandfather, I learned little save that most of the deeds, good and bad, incurring opprobrium or plaudits or reward either, within the scope of man's abilities, had already been performed, and were to be learned about only from books. So I listened when he would read to us. I realize now that on most of these occasions he resorted to reading aloud only when he saw that the moment had come when his entire school was on the point of rising and leaving the room. But whatever the reason, he read to us, and I, anyway, listened, though I did not know that in that listening I was equipping myself better for what I should later design to do than if I had learned all the addition and subtraction in the book. That was how I learned of the West Indies. Not where they were, though if I had known at the time that that knowledge would someday serve me, I would have learned that too. What I learned was that there was a place called the West Indies to which poor men went in ships and became rich. It didn't matter how, so long as that man was clever and courageous, the latter of which I believed that I possessed, the former of which I believed that if it were to be learned by energy and will in the school of endeavor and experience, I should learn. I remember how I remained one afternoon when school was out and waited for the teacher, waylaid him. He was a smallish man who always looked dusty, as if he had been born and lived all his life in attics and storerooms, and stepped out. I recall how he started back when he saw me, and how I thought at the time that if I were to strike him, there would be no resulting outcry, but merely the sound of the blow and a puff of dust in the air, as when you strike a rug hanging from a line. I asked him if it were true, if what he had read us about the men who got rich in the West Indies were true. Why not, he answered, starting back. Didn't you hear me read it from the book? How do I know that what you read was in the book? I said. I was that green, that countrified, you see. I had not then learned to read my own name. Although I had been attending the school for almost 3 months, I dare say I knew no more than I did when I entered the schoolroom for the first time. But I had to know, you see. Perhaps a man builds for his future in more ways than one, builds not only toward the body, which will be his tomorrow or next year, but toward actions and the subsequent irrevocable courses of resultant action, which his weak senses and intellect cannot foresee, but which 10 or 20 or 30 years from now he will have to take, in order to survive the act. Perhaps it was that instinct and not I who grasped one of his arms as he drew back. I did not actually doubt him. I think that even there, even at my age, I realized that he could not have invented it, that he lacked that something which is necessary in a man to enable him to fool even a child by lying. But you see, I had to be sure, had to take whatever method that came to my hand to make sure. And there was nothing else to hand except him, glaring at me and beginning to struggle, and I holding him and saying, I was quite calm, I just had to know, saying, suppose I went there and found out that it was not so, and he shrieking now, shouting, help, help, so that I let him go. So when the time came when I realized that to accomplish my design I should need first of all and above all things money in considerable quantities and in the quite immediate future, I remembered what he had read to us, and I went to the West Indies. Then the other guests began to ride up, and after a while the niggers came back with the coffee pot and a deer haunch and the whiskey, and 1 bottle of champagne, which they had overlooked, Grandfather said, and he stopped talking for a while. He didn't tell any more of it until they had eaten and were sitting around smoking, while the niggers and the dogs, they had to drag the dogs away from the tree, but especially away from the sapling pole with the architect's suspenders tied to it, as if it was not only that the pole was the last thing the architect had touched, but it was the thing his exultation had touched when he saw another chance to elude them And so it was not only the man, but the exultation, too, which the dogs smelled that made them wild, made casts in all directions, getting further and further away until just before sundown, one of the niggers whooped, and he hadn't spoken for some time, Grandfather said, lying there on one elbow in the fine boots and the only pants he had and the shirt he had put on when he came out of the mud and washed himself off after he realized that he would have to hunt the architect down himself if he wanted him back alive, probably, not talking himself, and maybe not even listening while the men talked about cotton and politics, just smoking the cigar Grandfather had given him and looking at the fire embers, and maybe making that West Indian voyage again that he had made when he was 14 and didn't even know where he was going or if he would ever get there or not. No more way of knowing whether the men who said the ship was going there were lying or not than he had of knowing whether or not the school teacher was telling the truth about what was in the book. And he never told whether the voyage was hard or not, how much he must have had to endure to make it, which of course he did have to endure, but then he believed that all necessary was courage and shrewdness, and the one he knew he had, and the other he believed he could learn if it were to be taught. And it probably the hardship of the voyage which comforted him that the men who said the ship was going to the West Indies had not lied to him, because at that time, Grandfather said, he probably could not have believed in anything that was easy. He said, "There it is," and got up, and they all went on and found where the architect had come back to the ground again with a gain of almost 3 hours. So they had to go fast now, and there wasn't much time to talk, or at least Grandfather said he did not appear to intend to resume. Then the sun went down, and the other men had to start back to town. They all went except Grandfather, because he wanted to listen some more. So he sent word in by one of the others, he was not married then either, that he would not be home, and he and Sutpen went on until the light failed. 2 of the niggers, they were 13 miles from Sutpen's camp then, had already gone back to get blankets and more grub. Then it was dark, and the niggers began to light pine knots, and they went on for a little while yet, gaining what they could now, since they knew that the architect would have had to den soon after dark to keep from traveling in a circle. That was how Grandfather remembered it. He and Sutpen leading their horses. He would look back now and then and see the horses' eyes shining in the torchlight, and the horses' heads tossing, and the shadows slipping along their shoulders and flanks. And the dogs and the niggers mostly still naked except for a pair of pants here and there, with the pine torches smoking and flaring above them, and the red light on their round heads and arms, and the mud they wore in the swamp to keep the mosquitoes off, dried hard and shiny, glinting like glass or china, and the shadows they cast, taller than they were at one moment, then gone the next, and even the trees and brakes and thickets there one moment and gone the next, though you knew all the time that they were still there because you could feel them with your breathing. As though invisible, they pressed down and condensed the invisible air you breathed. And he said how Sutpen was talking about it again, telling him again before he realized that this was some more of it. And he said how he thought there was something about a man's destiny, or about the man, that caused the destiny to shape itself like his clothes did, like the same coat that new might have fitted 1,000 men, yet after one man has worn it for a while, it fits no one else, and you can tell it anywhere you see it, even if all you see is a sleeve or a lapel, so that the demon's, Shreve said, destiny had fitted itself to him, to his innocence, his pristine aptitude for platform drama and childlike heroic simplicity, just as the fine broadcloth uniform, which you could have seen on 10,000 men during those 4 years, which he wore when he came in the office on that afternoon 30 years later, had fitted itself to the swaggering of all his gestures, and to the forensic verbiage in which he stated calmly, with that frank innocence which we call of a child, except that a human child is the only living creature that is never either frank or innocent, the most simple and the most outrageous things. He was telling some more of it already into what he was telling, yet still without telling how he got to where he was, nor even how what he was now involved in, obviously at least 20 years old now, crouching behind a window in the dark and firing the muskets through it, which someone else loaded and handed to him, came to occur, getting himself and Grandfather both into that besieged Haitian room as simply as he got to the West Indies by saying that he decided to go to the West Indies. And so he went there. This anecdote, no deliberate continuation of the other one, but merely called to his mind by the picture of the niggers and torches in front of them, he not telling how he got there, what had happened during the 6 years between that day when he, a boy of 14 who knew no tongue but English, and not much of that, had decided to go to the West Indies and become rich, and this night when overseer or foreman or something to a French sugar planter, he was barricaded in the house with the planter's family. And now Grandfather said there was the first mention, a shadow that almost emerged for a moment and then faded again, but not completely away, of the... "It's a girl," Shreve said. "Don't tell me, just go on," whom he was to tell Grandfather 30 years afterward he had found unsuitable to his purpose, and so put aside, though providing for her, and a few frightened half-breed servants, which he would have to turn from the window from time to time and kick and curse into helping the girl load the muskets which he and the planter fired through the windows. And I reckon Grandfather was saying, "Wait, wait, for God's sake, wait," about like you are, until he finally did stop and back up and start over again with at least some regard for cause and effect, even if none for logical sequence and continuity. Or maybe it was the fact that they were sitting again now, having decided that they had gone far enough for that night, and the niggers had made camp and cooked supper, and he and Grandfather, drank some of the whiskey, and ate, and then sat before the fire drinking some more of the whiskey, and he telling it all over, and still it was not absolutely clear, the how and the why he was there and what he was, since he was not talking about himself. He was telling a story. He was not bragging about something he had done. He was just telling a story about something a man named Thomas Sutpen had experienced, which would still have been the same story if the man had had no name at all, if it had been told about any man or no man over whiskey at night. That may have been what slowed him down, but it was not enough to clarify the story much. He still was not recounting to Grandfather the career of somebody named Thomas Sutpen. Grandfather said the only mention he ever made to those 6 or 7 years, which must have existed somewhere, must have actually occurred, was about the patois he had to learn in order to oversee the plantation, and the French he had to learn, maybe not to get engaged to be married, but which he would certainly need to be able to repudiate the wife after he had already got her. How, so he told Grandfather, he had believed that courage and shrewdness would be enough, but found that he was wrong, and how sorry he was that he had not taken the schooling along with the West Indian lore when he discovered that all people did not speak the same tongue, and realized that he would not only need courage and skill, he would have to learn to speak a new language, else that design to which he had dedicated himself would die stillborn. So he learned the language, just like he learned to be a sailor, I reckon, because Grandfather asked him why he didn't get himself a girl to live with and learn it the easy way, and Grandfather said how he sat there with the firelight on his face, and the beard and his eyes quiet and sort of bright, and Grandfather said it was the only time he ever knew him to say anything quiet and simple. On this night I'm speaking of, and until my first marriage, I might add, I was still a virgin. You will probably not believe that, and if I were to try to explain it, you would disbelieve me more than ever. So I will only say that that, too, was a part of the design which I had in my mind. And Grandfather said, "Why shouldn't I believe it?" And he looking at Grandfather still with that quiet, bright expression about the eyes, saying, "But do you? Surely you don't hold me in such small contempt as to believe that at 20 I could neither have suffered temptation nor offered it?" And Grandfather said, "You're right, I shouldn't believe it, but I do." So it was no tale about women, and certainly not about love, the woman, the girl, just that shadow which could load a musket, but which could not have been trusted to fire one out of the window that night, or the 7 or 8 nights while they huddled in the dark and watched from the windows the barns or granaries, or whatever it is you harvest sugar into, and the fields, too, blazing and smoking. He said how you could smell it. You could smell nothing else. The rank, sweet, rich smell, as if the hatred and the implacability, the 1,000 secret dark years which had created the hatred and implacability, had intensified the smell of the sugar. And Grandfather said how he remembered then that he had seen Sutpin each time decline sugar for his coffee. And so he, Grandfather, knew why now, but he had asked anyway to be sure, and Sutpin told him it was true, that he had not been afraid until after the fields and barns were all burned, and they had even forgot about the smell of the burning sugar, but that he had never been able to bear sugar since. The girl just emerging for a second of the telling, in a single word almost, so that Grandfather said it was like he had just seen her too for a second by the flash of one of the muskets. A bent face, a single cheek, a chin for an instant beyond a curtain of fallen hair, a white, slender arm raised, a delicate hand clutching a ramrod, and that was all. No more detail and information about that than about how he got from the field, his overseeing, into the besieged house when the niggers rushed at him with their machetes, than how he got from the rotting cabin in Virginia to the fields he oversaw. And this, Grandfather said, more incredible to him than the getting there from Virginia, because that did infer time, a space, the getting across which did indicate something of leisureliness, since time is longer than any distance, while the other, the getting from the fields into the barricaded house, seemed to have occurred with a sort of violent abrogation, which must have been almost as short as his telling about it, a very condensation of time, which was the gauge of its own violence, and he telling it in that pleasant, faintly forensic, anecdotal manner, apparently just as he remembered it, was impressed by it through detached and impersonal interest and curiosity, which even fear, that once when he mentioned fear by the same inverse process of speaking of a time when he was not afraid, before he became afraid, he put it, failed to leaven very much. Because he was not afraid until after it was all over, Grandfather said, because that was all it was to him, a spectacle, something to be watched, because he might not have a chance to see such again, since his innocence still functioned. And he not only did not know what fear was until afterward, he did not even know that at first he was not terrified. He did not even know that he had found the place where money was to be had quick if you were courageous and shrewd. He did not mean shrewdness, Grandfather said. What he meant was unscrupulousness, only he didn't know that word, because it would not have been in the book from which the school teacher read. Or maybe that was what he meant by courage, Grandfather said. But where high mortality was concomitant with the money, and the sheen on the dollars was not from gold, but from blood. A spot of earth which might have been created and set aside by heaven itself, Grandfather said, as a theater for violence and injustice and bloodshed, and all the satanic lusts of human greed and cruelty, for the last despairing fury of all the pariah interdict and all the doomed. A little island set in a smiling and fury-lurked and incredible indigo sea, which was the halfway point between what we call the jungle and what we call civilization, halfway between the dark, inscrutable continent from which the black blood, the black bones and flesh and thinking and remembering and hopes and desires was ravished by violence, and the cold, known land to which it was doomed, the civilized land and people which had expelled some of its own blood and thinking and desires that had become too crass to be faced and borne longer, and set it homeless and desperate on the lonely ocean, a little lost island in a latitude which would require 10,000 years of equatorial heritage to bear its climate, a soil manured with black blood from 200 years of oppression and exploitation, until it sprang with an incredible paradox of peaceful greenery and crimson flowers and sugar-cane sapling size and 3 times the height of a man and a little bulkier, of course, but valuable pound for pound almost with silver ore, as if nature held a balance and kept a book and offered a recompense for the torn limbs and outraged hearts, even if man did not. The planting of nature and man, too, watered not only by the wasted blood, but breathed over by the winds in which the doomed ships had fled in vain, out of which the last tatter of sail had sunk into the blue sea, along which the last vain, despairing cry of woman or child had blown away. The planting of men, too, the yet intact bones and brains into which the old unsleeping blood that had vanished into the earth they trod still cried out for vengeance. And he, overseeing it, riding peacefully about on his horse while he learned the language, that meager and fragile thread, Grandfather said, by which the little surface corners and edges of men's secret and solitary lives may be joined for an instant now and then, before sinking back into the darkness, where the spirit cried for the first time and was not heard, and will cry for the last time and will not be heard then either. Not knowing that what he rode upon was a volcano, hearing the air tremble and throb at night with the drums and the chanting, and not knowing that it was the heart of the earth itself he heard, who believed, Grandfather said, that earth was kind and gentle, and the darkness was merely something you saw or could not see in. Overseeing what he oversaw, and not knowing that he was overseeing it, making his daily expeditions from an armed citadel until the day itself came, and he not telling that either. How that day happened, the steps leading up to it, because Grandfather said he apparently did not know, comprehend what he must have been seeing every day because of that innocence. A pig's bone with a little rotten flesh still clinging to it, a few chicken feathers, a stained, dirty rag with a few pebbles tied up in it found on the old man's pillow one morning, and none knew, least of all, the planter himself who had been asleep on the pillow, how it had come there, because they learned at the same time that all the servants, the half-breeds, were missing. And he did not know until the planter told him that the stains on the rag were neither dirt nor grease, but blood, nor that what he took to be the planter's Gallic rage was actually fear, terror, and he, just curious and quite interested, because he still looked upon the planter and the daughter both, he told Grandfather how until that first night of the siege he had not once thought that he did not know the girl's Christian name, whether he had ever heard it or not. He also told Grandfather, dropped this into the telling, as you might flick the joker out of a pack of fresh cards without being able to remember later whether you had removed the joker or not, that the old man's wife had been a Spaniard, and so it was Grandfather and not Sutpin who realized that until that first night of the attack he had possibly not seen the girl as much as a dozen times. As foreigners, the body of one of the half-breeds found at last, he found it, hunted it for 2 days without even knowing that what he was meeting was a blank wall of black secret faces, a wall behind which almost anything could be preparing to happen, and as he learned later, almost anything was, and on the 3rd day found the body where he could not possibly have missed it during the first hour of the day if it had been there, and he, sitting on the log, Grandfather said, telling it, making the gestures to tell it with, whom Grandfather himself had seen fight naked, chest to chest, with one of his wild niggers, by the light of the campfire, while his house was building, and who still fought with them by lantern light in the stable after he had got at last that wife who would be adjunctive to the forwarding of that design he had in mind. And no bones about the fighting either, no hand-shaking and gratulations while he washed the blood off and donned his shirt, because at the end of it the nigger would be flat on his back, with his chest heaving, and another nigger throwing water on him, sitting there and telling Grandfather how at last he found the half-breed, or what used to be the half-breed, and that he, Sutpin, had seen as much as most men, and had done as much as most, including some things which he did not boast about, but that there were some things which a man who pretended to be civilized saw when he had to, but which he did not talk about. So he would only say that he found the half-breed at last, and so began to comprehend that the situation might become serious. Then the house, the barricade, the 5 of them, the planter, the daughter, 2 women servants, and himself, shut up in it, and the air filled with the smoke and smell of burning cane, and the glare and smoke of it on the sky, and the air throbbing and trembling with the drums and the chanting. The little lost island beneath its down-cupped bowl of alternating day and night like a vacuum into which no help could come, where not even winds from the outer world came, but only the trades, the same weary winds blowing back and forth across it, and burdened still with the weary voices of murdered women and children, homeless and graveless, about the isolating and solitary sea, while the 2 servants and the girl, whose Christian name he did not yet know, loaded the muskets which he and the father fired at no enemy, but at the Haytian night itself, lancing their little vain and puny flashes into the brooding and blood-weary and throbbing darkness. And at the very time of year, the season between hurricanes and any hope of rain, and how on the 8th night the water gave out, and something had to be done, so he put the musket down and went out and subdued them. That was how he told it. He went out and subdued them. And when he returned, he and the girl became engaged to marry. And Grandfather saying, "Wait, wait," sure enough now, saying, "But you didn't even know her. You told me that when the siege began you didn't even know her name." And he looked at Grandfather and said, "Yes. But you see, it took me some time to recover." Not how he did it. He didn't tell that either. That of no moment to the story either. He just put the musket down, and had someone unbar the door, and then bar it behind him, and walked out into the darkness, and subdued them. Maybe by yelling louder, maybe by standing, bearing more than they believed any bones and flesh could or should. Should, yes, that would be the terrible thing, to find flesh to stand more than flesh should be asked to stand. Maybe at last they themselves turning in horror, and fleeing from the white arms and legs shaped like theirs, and from which blood could be made to spurt and flow as it could from theirs, and containing an indomitable spirit which should have come from the same primary fire which theirs came from, but which could not possibly have. He showed Grandfather the scars, one of which, Grandfather said, came pretty near leaving him that virgin for the rest of his life, too. And then daylight came, with no drums in it, for the first time in 8 days, and they emerged, probably the man and the daughter, and walked across the burned land with the bright sun shining down on it as if nothing had happened, walking now in what must have been an incredible, desolate solitude and peaceful quiet, and found him and brought him to the house, and when he recovered, he and the girl were engaged. Then he stopped. "All right," Shreve said. "Go on." I said he stopped. Quentin said, "I heard you. Stopped what? How, got engaged and then stopped, yet still had a wife to repudiate later? You said he didn't remember how he got to Haiti, and then he didn't remember how he got into the house with the niggers surrounding it. Now you're going to tell me he didn't even remember getting married? That he got engaged and that he decided he would stop? Only one day he found out he hadn't stopped, but on the contrary he was married? And all you called him was just a virgin?" "He stopped talking, telling it," Quentin said. He had not moved, talking apparently, if to anything, to the letter lying on the open book on the table between his hands. Opposite him, Shreve had filled the pipe and smoked it out again. It lay again, overturned, a scattering of white ashes fanning out from the bowl onto the table before his crossed naked arms, with which he appeared at the same time both to support and hug himself, since although it was only 11 o'clock, the room was beginning to cool toward that point where, about midnight, there would be only enough heat in the radiators to keep the pipes from freezing, though he would not perform his deep breathing in the open window tonight at all, He had yet to go to the bedroom and return first with his bathrobe on, and next with his overcoat on top of the bathrobe, and Quentin's overcoat on his arm. He just said that he was now engaged to be married, and then he stopped telling it. He just stopped, Grandfather said, flat and final, like that. Like that was all there was, all there could be to it. All of it that made good listening from one man to another over whiskey at night. Maybe it was. His, Quentin's, face was lowered. He spoke still in that curious, that almost sullen, flat tone which had caused Shreve to watch him from the beginning with intent, detached speculation and curiosity, to watch him still from behind his, Shreve's, expression of cherubic and erudite amazement, which the spectacles intensified, or perhaps actually created. He just got up and looked at the whiskey bottle and said, "No more tonight. We'll get to sleep. We want to get an early start tomorrow. Maybe we can catch him before he limbers up." But they didn't. It was late afternoon before they caught him, the architect, I mean, and then only because he had hurt his leg trying to architect himself across the river. But he made a mistake in the calculation this time, so the dogs and the niggers bayed him, and the niggers making the racket now. Grandfather said how maybe the niggers believed that by fleeing, the architect had voluntarily surrendered his status as interdict meat, had voluntarily offered the gambit by fleeing, which the niggers had accepted by chasing him, and won by catching him, and that now they would be allowed to cook and eat him, both victors and vanquished accepting this in the same spirit of sport and sportsmanship, and no rancor or hard feelings on either side. As they hauled him out, all the men who had started the race yesterday had come back except 3, and the ones that returned had brought others, so there were more of them now than when the race started, Grandfather said, hauled him out of his cave under the river bank, a little man with one sleeve missing from his frock coat and his flowered vest ruined by water and mud where he had fallen in the river, and one pants leg ripped down so they could see where he had tied up his leg with a piece of his shirt-tail, and the rag bloody and the leg swollen, and his hat was completely gone. They never did find it, so Grandfather gave him a new hat the day he left when the house was finished. It was in Grandfather's office, and Grandfather said the architect took the new hat and looked at it and burst into tears. A little harried, wild-faced man with a 2 days' stubble of beard, who came out of the cave fighting like a wildcat, hurt leg and all, with the dogs barking and the niggers whooping and hollering with deadly and merry anticipation, like they were under the impression that since the race had lasted more than 24 hours, the rules would be automatically abrogated and they would not have to wait to cook him, until Sutpin waded in with a short stick and beat niggers and dogs all away, leaving the architect standing there, not scared worth a damn either, just panting a little, and Grandfather said a little sick in the face, where the niggers had mishandled his leg in the heat of the capture, and making them a speech in French, a long one, and so fast that Grandfather said probably another Frenchman could not have understood all of it, but it sounded fine. Grandfather said even he, all of them, could tell that the architect was not apologizing. It was fine, Grandfather said. And he said how Sutpin turned toward him, but he, Grandfather, was already approaching the architect, holding out the bottle of whiskey already uncorked. And Grandfather saw the eyes in the gaunt face, the eyes desperate and hopeless, but indomitable too, invincible too, not beaten yet by a damn sight, Grandfather said. And all that 50-odd hours of dark and swamp and sleeplessness and fatigue and no grub and nowhere to go and no hope of getting there, just a will to endure, and a foreknowing of defeat, but not beat yet by a damn sight. And he took the bottle in one of his little dirty, coon-like hands, and raised the other hand, and even fumbled about his head for a second, before he remembered that the hat was gone, then flung the hand up in a gesture that Grandfather said you simply could not describe, that seemed to gather all misfortune and defeat that the human race ever suffered into a little pinch in his fingers like dust, and fling it backward over his head. And he raised the bottle and bowed first to grandfather, then to all the other men sitting their horses in a circle and looking at him. And then he took not only the first drink of neat whiskey he ever took in his life, but the drink of it that he could no more have conceived himself taking than the Brahmin can believe that that situation can conceivably arise in which he will eat dog. Quentin ceased. At once Shreve said, "All right, don't bother to say he stopped now. Just go on." But Quentin did not continue at once. The flat, curiously dead voice, the downcast face, the relaxed body not stirring except to breathe, the two of them not moving except to breathe, both young, both born within the same year, the one in Alberta, the other in Mississippi, born half a continent apart, yet joined, connected after a fashion in a sort of geographical transubstantiation by that continental trough, that river which runs not only through the physical land of which it is the geologic umbilical, not only runs through the spiritual lives of the beings within its scope, but is very environment itself, which laughs at degrees of latitude and temperature. Though some of these beings, like Shreve, have never seen it, the two of them who 4 months ago had never laid eyes on one another, yet who since had slept in the same room and eaten side by side of the same food, and used the same books from which to prepare to recite in the same freshman courses, facing one another across the lamplit table on which lay the fragile Pandora's box of scrawled paper, which had filled with violent and unratiocinative jinns and demons this snug monastic coin, this dreamy and heatless alcove of what we call the best of thought. "Just don't bother," Shreve said. "Just get on with it." "That would take 30 years, Quentin said. It was 30 years before he told grandfather any more of it. Maybe he was too busy, all his time for spare talking taken up with furthering that design which he had in mind, and his only relaxation fighting his wild niggers in the stable, where the men could hitch their horses and come up from the back, and not be seen from the house, because he was already married now, his house finished, and he already arrested for stealing it, and freed again, so that all was settled, with a wife and 2 children, no, 3 in it, and his land cleared and planted with the seed grandfather loaned him, and him getting rich, good and steady now. "Yes," Shreve said. "Mr. Coldfield, what was that?" "I don't know," Quentin said. Nobody ever did know for certain. It was something about a bill of lading, some way he persuaded Mr. Coldfield to use his credit. One of those things that when they work you are smart, and when they don't you change your name and move to Texas. And Father said how Mr. Coldfield must have sat back there in his little store and watched his wagon load of stock double maybe every 10 years, or at least not lose any ground, and seen the chance to do that very same thing all the time, only his conscience, not his courage, Father said he had plenty of that, wouldn't let him. Then Sutpin came along and offered to do it, he and Mr. Coldfield to divide the loot if it worked, and he, Sutpin, to take all the blame if it didn't, and Mr. Coldfield let him. Father said it was because Mr. Coldfield did not believe it would work, that they would get away with it. Only he couldn't quit thinking about it. And so when they tried it and it failed, he, Mr. Coldfield, would be able to get it out of his mind then. And that when it did fail and they were caught, Mr. Coldfield would insist on taking his share of the blame as penance and expiation for having sinned in his mind all those years. Because Mr. Coldfield never did believe it would work. So when he saw that it was going to work, had worked, the least thing he could do was to refuse to take his share of the profits. That when he saw that it had worked, it was his conscience he hated, not Sutpin. His conscience and the land, the country which had created his conscience, and then offered the opportunity to have made all that money to the conscience which it had created, which could do nothing but decline. Hated that country so much that he was even glad when he saw it drifting closer and closer to a doomed and fatal war. that he would have joined the Yankee army, Father said, only he was not a soldier, and knew that he would either be killed or die of hardship, and so not be present on that day when the South would realize that it was now paying the price for having erected its economic edifice, not on the rock of stern morality, but on the shifting sands of opportunism and moral brigandage. So he chose the only gesture he could think of to impress his disapproval on those who should outlive the fighting and so participate in the remorse. "Sure," Shreve said, "that's fine, but Sutpen, the design. Get on now." "Yes," Quentin said, "the design. Getting richer and richer. It must have looked fine and clear ahead for him now. House finished, and even bigger and whiter than the one he had gone to the door of that day, and the nigger came in his monkey clothes and told him to go to the back, and he with his own brand of niggers even, which the man who lay in the hammock with his shoes off didn't have, to cull one from and train him to go to the door when his turn came for a little boy without any shoes on, and his pap's cut-down pants for clothes to come and knock on it. Only Father said that that wasn't it now. That when he came to Grandfather's office that day after the 30 years, and not trying to excuse now any more than he had tried in the bottom that night when they ran the architect, but just to explain now, trying hard to explain now, because now he was old and knew it was being old that he had to talk against, time shortening ahead of him that could and would do things to his chances and possibilities, even if he had no more doubt of his bones and flesh than he did of his will and courage, telling Grandfather that the boy symbol at the door wasn't it, because the boy symbol was just the figment of the amazed and desperate child, that now he would take that boy in where he would never again need to stand on the outside of a white door and knock at it, and not at all for mere shelter, but so that that boy, that whatever nameless stranger, could shut that door himself forever behind him on all that he had ever known, and look ahead along the still undivulged light rays in which his descendants, who might not even hear the boy's name, waited to be born, without even having to know that they had once been riven forever free from brutehood, just as his own Sutpen's children were. "Don't say it's just me that sounds like your old man," Shreve said. "But go on, Sutpen's children, go on." "Yes," Quentin said, "the two children," thinking, "Yes, maybe we are both father. Maybe nothing ever happens once and is finished. Maybe happen is never once, but like ripples maybe on water after the pebble sinks, the ripples moving on, spreading, the pool attached by a narrow umbilical water cord to the next pool, which the first pool feeds, has fed, did feed. Let this second pool contain a different temperature of water, a different molecularity of having seen, felt, remembered. Reflect in a different tone the infinite unchanging sky, it doesn't matter. That pebble's watery echo, whose fall it did not even see, moves across its surface too at the original ripple space, to the old ineradicable rhythm. Thinking, yes, we are both father, or maybe father and I are both Shreve. Maybe it took Father and me both to make Shreve, or Shreve and me both to make Father, or maybe Thomas Sutpen to make all of us. Yes, the two children, the son and the daughter by sex and age, so glib to the design that he might have planned that too, by character, mental and physical, so glib to it, that he might have culled them out of the celestial herd of seraphs and cherubim, like he chose his 20 niggers out of whatever swapping there must have been when he repudiated that first wife and that child, when he discovered that they would not be adjunctive to the forwarding of the design. And Grandfather said there was no conscience about that Sutpen sat in the office that afternoon after 30 years and told him how his conscience had bothered him somewhat at first, but that he had argued calmly and logically with his conscience until it was settled, just as he must have argued with his conscience about his and Mr. Coldfield's bill of lading, only probably not as long here, since time here would be pressing, until that was settled. how he granted that by certain lights there was injustice in what he did, but that he had obviated that as much as lay in his power by being above board in the matter. That he could have simply deserted her, could have taken his hat and walked out, but he did not. And that he had what grandfather would have to admit was a good and valid claim, if not to the whole place which he alone had saved, as well as the lives of all the white people on it, at least to that portion of it which had been specifically described and deeded to him in the marriage settlement, which he had entered in good faith, with no reservations as to his obscure origin and material equipment, while there had been not only reservation, but actual misrepresentation on their part, and misrepresentation of such a crass nature as to have not only voided and frustrated, without his knowing it, the central motivation of his entire design, but would have made an ironic delusion of all that he had suffered and endured in the past, and all that he could ever accomplish in the future toward that design, which claim he had voluntarily relinquished, taking only the 20 niggers out of all he might have claimed, and which many another man in his place would have insisted upon keeping, and in which contention would have been supported by both legal and moral sanction, even if not the delicate one of conscience. And grandfather not saying, "Wait, wait now," because it was that innocence again, that innocence which believed that the ingredients of morality were like the ingredients of pie or cake, and once you had measured them and balanced them and mixed them and put them into the oven, it was all finished, and nothing but pie or cake could come out. Yes, sitting there in grandfather's office, trying to explain with that patient, amazed recapitulation, not to grandfather and not to himself, because grandfather said that his very calmness was indication that he had long since given up any hope of ever understanding it, but trying to explain to circumstance, to fate itself, the logical steps by which he had arrived at a result absolutely and forever incredible, repeating the clear and simple synopsis of his history, which he and grandfather both now knew, as if he were trying to explain it to an intractable and unpredictable child. You see, I had a design in mind. Whether it was a good or a bad design is beside the point. The question is, where did I make the mistake in it? What did I do or misdo in it? Whom or what injure by it to the extent which this would indicate? I had a design. To accomplish it, I should require money, a house, a plantation, slaves, a family, incidentally, of course, a wife. I set out to acquire these, asking no favor of any man. I even risked my life at one time, as I told you, though, as I also told you, I did not undertake this risk purely and simply to gain a wife, though it did have that result. But that is beside the point also. Suffice that I had the wife, accepted her in good faith, with no reservations about myself, and I expected as much from them. I did not even demand, mind, as one of my obscure origin might have been expected to do, or at least be condoned in the doing, out of ignorance of gentility in dealing with gentle-born people. I did not demand. I accepted them at their own valuation, while insisting on my own part upon explaining fully about myself and my progenitors. Yet they deliberately withheld from me the one fact which I have reason to know they were aware would have caused me to decline the entire matter. Otherwise they would not have withheld it from me, a fact which I did not learn until after my son was born, and even then I did not act hastily. I could have reminded them of these wasted years, these years which would now leave me behind with my schedule, not only the amount of elapsed time which their number represented, but that compensatory amount of time represented by their number which I should now have to spend to advance myself once more to the point I had reached and lost. But I did not. I merely explained how this new fact rendered it impossible that this woman and child be incorporated in my design, and following which, as I told you, I made no attempt to keep not only that which I might consider myself to have earned at the risk of my life, but which had been given to me by signed testimonials. But on the contrary, I declined and resigned all right and claim to this, in order that I might repair whatever injustice I might be considered to have done by so providing for the two persons whom I might be considered to have deprived of anything I might later possess. And this was agreed to, mind, agreed to between the two parties. And yet, and after more than 30 years after my conscience had finally assured me that if I had done an injustice, I had done what I could to rectify it, and grandfather not saying, "Wait now," but saying, hollering maybe even, "Conscience? Conscience? Good God, man, what else did you expect? Didn't the very affinity and instinct for misfortune of a man who had spent that much time in a monastery even, let alone one who had lived that many years as you lived them, tell you better than that? Didn't the dread and fear of females, which you must have drawn in with the primary mammalian milk, teach you better? What kind of abysmal and purblind innocence could that have been, which someone told you to call virginity? What conscience to trade with, which would have warranted you in the belief that you could have bought immunity from her for no other coin but justice?" It was at this point that Shreve went to the bedroom and put on the bathrobe. He did not say, "Wait." He just rose and left Quentin sitting before the table, the open book and the letter, and went out and returned in the robe and sat again and took up the cold pipe, though without filling it anew or lighting it as it was. "All right," he said. "So that Christmas Henry brought him home, into the house. Go on." "Yes," Quentin said. "Father said he probably named him himself. Charles Bond. Charles Good. He didn't tell Grandfather that he did, but Grandfather believed he did, would have. That would have been a part of the cleaning up, just as he would have done his share toward cleaning up the exploded caps and musket cartridges after the siege, if he hadn't been sick or maybe engaged. He would have insisted on it, maybe. The conscience again, which could not allow her and the child any place in the design, even though he could have closed his eyes, and, if not fooled the rest of the world as they had fooled him, at least have frightened any man out of speaking the secret aloud. The same conscience which would not permit the child, since it was a boy, to bear either his name or that of its maternal grandfather, yet which would also forbid him to do the customary and provide a quick husband for the discarded woman, and so give his son an authentic name. He chose the name himself, Grandfather believed, just as he named them all, the Charles Goods and the Clytemnestras and Henry and Judith and all of them, that entire fecundity of dragon's teeth, as Father called it. And Father said, "Your father," Shreve said, "he seems to have got an awful lot of delayed information awful quick after having waited 45 years. If he knew all this, what was his reason for telling you that the trouble between Henry and Bon was the octoroon woman?" "He didn't know it then. Grandfather didn't tell him all of it either, like Sutpin never told Grandfather quite all of it." "Then who did tell him?" "I did." Quentin did not move, did not look up while Shreve watched him. "The day after after that night when we—" "Oh," Shreve said. "After you and the old aunt. I see. Go on. And Father said how he must have stood there on the front gallery that afternoon and waited for Henry and the friend Henry had been writing home about all fall to come up the drive. And that maybe after Henry wrote the name in the first letter, Sutpin probably told himself it couldn't be, that there was a limit even to irony, beyond which it became either just vicious but not fatal horseplay, or harmless coincidence, since Father said that even Sutpin probably knew that nobody yet ever invented a name that somebody didn't own now or hadn't owned once. And they rode up at last, and Henry said, 'Father, this is Charles,' and he, the demon," Shreve said, "saw the face, and knew that there are situations where coincidence is no more than the little child that rushes out onto a football field to take part in the game, and the players run over and around the unscathed head and go on and shock together, and in the fury of the struggle for the facts called gain or loss, nobody even remembers the child, nor saw who came and snatched it back from dissolution. That he stood there at his own door, just as he had imagined, planned, designed, and sure enough, and after 50 years, the forlorn, nameless, and homeless lost child came to knock at it, and no monkey-dressed nigger anywhere under the sun to come to the door and order the child away. And Father said that even then, even though he knew that Bon and Judith had never laid eyes on one another, he must have felt and heard the design, house, position, posterity, and all, come down like it had been built out of smoke, making no sound, creating no rush of displaced air, and not even leaving any debris. And he, not calling it retribution, no sins of the father come home to roost, not even calling it bad luck, but just a mistake. That mistake which he could not discover himself, and which he came to Grandfather not to excuse, but just to review the facts for an impartial, and Grandfather said he believed, a legally trained mind to examine and find and point out to him. Not moral retribution, you see. Just an old mistake in facts, which a man of courage and shrewdness, the one of which he now knew he possessed, the other of which he believed that he had now learned, acquired, could still combat if he could only find out what the mistake had been. Because he did not give up, he never did give up. Grandfather said that his subsequent actions, the fact that for a time he did nothing, and so perhaps helped to bring about the very situation which he dreaded, were not the result of any failing of courage or shrewdness or ruthlessness, but were the result of his conviction that it had all come from a mistake, and until he discovered what that mistake had been, he did not intend to risk making another one. So he invited Bon into the house, and for the 2 weeks of the vacation, only it didn't take that long, Father said that probably Mrs. Sutpen had Judith and Bon already engaged from the moment she saw Bon's name in Henry's first letter. He watched Bon and Henry and Judith, or watched Bon and Judith, rather, because he would have already known about Henry and Bon from Henry's letters about him from the school, watched them for 2 weeks and did nothing. Then Henry and Bon went back to school, and now the nigger groom that fetched the mail back and forth each week between Oxford and Sutpen's 100 brought letters to Judith now that were not in Henry's hand, and still he did nothing. He didn't do anything at all until spring was almost over, and Henry wrote that he was bringing Bon home with him to stay a day or two before Bon went home. Then Sutpen went to New Orleans. Whether he chose that time to go in order to get Bon and his mother together and thrash the business out for good and all or not, nobody knows. Just as nobody knows whether he ever saw the mother or not while he was there, if she received him or refused to receive him. Or, if she did, and he tried once more to come to terms with her, buy her off maybe with money now, since Father said that a man who could believe that a scorned and outraged and angry woman could be bought off with formal logic would believe that she could be placated with money, too, and it didn't work. Or, if Bon was there, and it was Bon himself who refused the offer, though nobody ever did know if Bon ever knew Sutpen was his father or not, whether he was trying to revenge his mother or not at first, and only later fell in love, only later succumbed to the current of retribution and fatality which Miss Roses said Sutpen had started and had doomed all his blood to, black and white both. But it didn't work, evidently, and the next Christmas came, and Henry and Bon came to Sutpen's 100 again, and now Sutpen saw there was no help for it, that Judith was in love with Bon, and whether Bon wanted revenge or was just caught and sunk and doomed too, it was all the same. So it seems that he sent for Henry that Christmas Eve, just before supper time. Father said that maybe by now, after his New Orleans trip, he had learned at last enough about women to know it wouldn't do any good to go to Judith first, and told Henry. And he knew what Henry would say, and Henry said it. And he took the lie from his son, and Henry knew by his father taking the lie that what his father had told him was true. And Father said that he, Sutpen, probably knew what Henry would do, too, and counted on Henry doing it because he still believed that it had been only a minor tactical mistake. And so he was like a skirmisher who is outnumbered yet cannot retreat, who believes that if he is just patient enough and clever enough and calm enough and alert enough, he can get the enemy scattered and pick them off one by one. And Henry did it. And he, Sutpin, probably knew what Henry would do next, too. That Henry, too, would go to New Orleans to find out for himself. Then it was 61, and Sutpin knew what they would do now. Not only what Henry would do, but what he would force Bond to do. Maybe, being a demon, though it would not require a demon to foresee war now, he even foresaw that Henry and Bond would join that student company at the university. He may have had some way of watching, knowing the day their names appeared on the roster, some way of knowing where the company was, even before Grandfather became colonel of the regiment the company was in until he got hurt at Pittsburgh Landing, where Bond was wounded, and came home to get used to not having any right arm. And Sutpin came home in 64 with the 2 tombstones, and talked to Grandfather in the office that day before both of them went back to the war. Knew all the time where Henry and Bond were, that they had been all the time in Grandfather's regiment, where Grandfather could look after them in a fashion, even if Grandfather didn't know that he was doing it, even if they needed watching, because Sutpin must have known about the probation, too, what Henry was doing now, holding all 3 of them, himself and Judith and Bond, in that suspension while he rested with his conscience to make it come to terms with what he wanted to do, just like his father had, that time more than 30 years ago, maybe even turned fatalist like Bond now, and giving the war a chance to settle the whole business by killing him or Bond or both of them, but with no help, no fudging on his part, because it was him that carried Bond to the rear after Pittsburgh Landing. Or maybe he knew that the South would be whipped, and then there wouldn't be anything left that mattered that much, worth getting that heated over, worth protesting against or suffering for, or dying for, or even living for. That was the day he came to the office, the demon's, Shreve said. One day of leave at home. Came home with his tombstones, and Judith was there, and I reckon he looked at her, and she looked at him, and he said, "You know where he is." And Judith didn't lie to him, and he knew Henry. He said, "But you have not heard from him yet." And Judith didn't lie about that either, and she didn't cry either, because both of them knew what would be in the letter when it came. So he didn't have to ask, "When he writes you that he is coming, you and Clytie will start making the wedding dress," even if Judith would have lied to him about that, which she would not have. So he put one of the stones on Ellen's grave and set the other one up in the hall and came in to see Grandfather, trying to explain it, seeing if Grandfather could discover that mistake which he believed was the sole cause of his problem, sitting there in his worn and shabby uniform, with his worn gauntlets and faded sash, and he would have had the plume, by all means. He might have had to discard his saber, but he would have had the plume in his hat, broken and frayed and soiled, with his horse saddled and waiting in the street below, and 1,000 miles to ride to find his regiment. Yet he sitting there on the one afternoon of his leave as though he had 1,000 of them, as if there were no haste nor urgency anywhere under the sun, and that when he departed he had no further to go than the 12 miles out to Sutpin's 100, and 1,000 days, or maybe even years, of monotony and rich peace, and he, even after he became dead, still there, still watching the fine grandsons and great-grandsons springing as far as eye could reach. He still, even though dead in the earth, that same fine figure of a man that Wash Jones called him, but not now. Now fog-bound by his own private embattlement of personal morality, that picayune splitting of abstract hairs, while, Grandfather said, Rome vanished and Jericho crumbled, that this would be right if, or that would be wrong, but of slowing blood and stiffening bones and arteries that Father says men resort to in senility, who, while young and supple and strong, reacted to a single simple yes, and a single simple no as instantaneous and complete and unthinking as the snapping on and off of electricity. Sitting there and talking, and now Grandfather not knowing what he was talking about, because now Grandfather said he did not believe that Sutpen himself knew, because even yet Sutpen had not quite told him all of it. And that morality again, Grandfather said, that morality which would not permit him to malign or traduce the memory of his first wife, or at least the memory of the marriage, even though he felt that he had been tricked by it, not even to an acquaintance in whose confidence and discretion he trusted enough to wish to justify himself, not even to his son by another marriage in order to preserve the status of his life's attainment and desire, except as a last resort. Not that he would hesitate then, Grandfather said, but not until then. He had been tricked by it himself, but he had extricated himself without asking or receiving help from any man. Let anyone else who might be so imposed upon do the same.